To join us. I'm David Downing, and we're going to have about a 20-second delay while we get an uplink going to YouTube, and then we'll start the official program in about 20 seconds. Any thoughts from my other speakers?
I'm looking forward to the conversation.
It's called C.S. Lewis and the Craft of Communication, and I'll show you an image of it here in a second once we get ready to go on YouTube. And I should work on memorizing your title, Steven. Do you go more by Steve or Steven?
Either one.
Either one's fine.
Steve's fine.
Regis Professor is what he told me to call him.
No.
Well, okay. Welcome to YouTube, you listeners and viewers on YouTube and on Zoom. I'm Dr. David Downing, the co-director of the Marion Wade Center in Wheaton, Illinois. You also see my co-director, Dr. Crystal Downing. She'll be fielding the questions at about 7:30. Jerry Root and I will be talking to Dr. Beebe for about a half hour, and then we'll be taking questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom. So let's go ahead and get started. Our book talk tonight is about C.S. Lewis and the Craft of Fiction, which is a book about C.S. Lewis as an effective communicator, both in speaking and writing. And the author is Dr. Steven Beebe, who is from earned his PhD from the University of Missouri. He is the title, I'm gonna have to read this. The Regents and University Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Communication Studies at Texas State University. And I'm sorry, we have run out of time after giving that full title. I should also mention that Dr. Beebe is a world-class communication scholar. He's written 14 textbooks that have gone through 75 editions on the art of communication from a scholarly standpoint. He also was the president of the National Communication Association and has received national awards from the National Speakers Association. So he's a highly renowned expert on communication as well as a communicator. I'll be talking to Dr. Beebe along with Jerry Root, who is a professor of evangelism at Wheaton College and also the director of the Evangelism Initiative. He is also a very effective communicator. This should be an interesting time. He has spoken at nearly 80 university campuses about C.S. Lewis and apologetics and evangelism. He's spoken in 20 different countries. The last 2 times I heard him speak, he received a standing ovation. So I'm really excited tonight to have 2 world-class communicators talking about a world-class communicator. So Jerry, do you want to start with a question for Steve about his new book?
Yeah, Professor Beebe, thanks for being with us. And thank you for your encouragement to me personally over the years. But I'm curious, how was it you first got interested in C.S. Lewis, and how did that interest grow and blossom to the place where you'd want to write a book about him?
I first went to Oxford in 1990 on a bus trip, and I was just enamored with Oxford. And I said, I have to find a way to come back here. So in 1993, my family and I spent a term in Oxford. And while I was there in 93, I thought to myself, I think this is where C.S. Lewis did some writing or worked. Until 1993, I had not read any C.S. Lewis. I did not read the Narnia Chronicles as a child. I'd heard about Lewis and I knew who he was. So I said, so I read a biography, the A.N. Wilson biography that some scholars will, their eyebrows might go up, but that's what I read. And I just became interested in him. So I thought, okay, let me read some of Lewis. And over the years, in about 4 or 5 years, I began to read and was with an excellent discussion group in Austin, Texas. And we took a book a month. And I kept raising my hand in these discussions and saying, do you see how this relates to communication? And I think they were very kind and very patient with me as I kept saying, do you see this? And yes, they wanted to talk about other ideas. So I kept seeing Lewis involved in what I do for a living is study communication.
I forgot to mention in my introduction that you were a visiting scholar at Oxford and at Cambridge, and you visited the Wade Center here in the Chicagoland. I forgot to mention that one of your major scholarly breakthroughs was in a laundromat in Texas. Is that correct?
Yes.
We need to get that story in later on in the interview.
Yes.
Excuse me, Jerry, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Professor Beebe.
Well, it relates to my continued journey with Lewis. So I started reading Lewis and saw these applications. And so in my next sabbatical in 2002, I went to Oxford and I said, let me study Lewis by simply looking at his manuscripts to see what I could learn about what he crossed out and how he edited. So I just started randomly looking at manuscripts in the Bodleian Library. And what I was disappointed to find that Lewis didn't make a lot of edits. A lot of what he wrote, because he spoke as he wrote, and I talked some about that in the book about his process. But I came across a manuscript that I hadn't seen before, and it started with the phrase, in a book like this, we should start with the origins of language, and it continued, and I didn't remember that. And so I was hoping to find it in the library so I wouldn't have to read Lewis's handwriting. And I didn't find it in the library. Because you can't check things out of the Bodleian Library, it took me 3 years of going back and forth to transcribe it. I still wasn't quite sure what it was until 2009, when I was in a laundromat. That's the laundromat story. Our washing machine had broken, and my wife Sue said, we need to go to do laundry. Okay. And I just happened to grab a book off the shelf, Diana Gleyer's book, The Company They Keep. And so I was sitting there doing my laundry, and Professor Gleyer talks about this manuscript and talks about that Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien had planned on writing a book together called Language and Human Nature, and that no one had seen it and it didn't exist. And I was doing my laundry, and it hit me. And I remember shouting in the laundromat, I know what it is. It was quite startled, and so were the patrons folding their underwear next to me. But that's when I connected, and I went home, and sure enough, I found things in the manuscript, like Lewis wrote, your authors believe, plural, and that I hadn't really understood. So what I had found was the manuscript of Lewis and Tolkien were going to write a book about language, which is what I was interested in. And that gave me really I'd planned on writing a book about Lewis and communication, but that really began the final push to put these ideas together that form the basis of my book.
You know, their composition methods were so different. I'm surprised that Lewis even considered that. Clear back in the 30s, they said, we should write the kind of fiction we like. Why don't you write a space story and I'll write a time story? And Lewis whipped out of the Silent Planet in about a year, but Tolkien never finished The Lost Road. I think that should have been a clue for Lewis that they probably didn't have the same style of composition to do a book together.
No, in Lewis's correspondence, he writes to one of his friends about this book, and that they were going to write together, and he called Tolkien that great, unmethodical, dilatory man, because it just wasn't writing this book that they'd hoped to write together, where Lewis had started it. So they talked about it. I wish they would have finished it. But my effort is to kind of piece together, what would Lewis have said if C.S. Lewis were to write a book about communication?
Before you go into a discussion of the content of your book and what you think he would have said, I'm curious about two other things. One, what was it that shaped Lewis as a communicator? What was the kind of man he brought to the table? Who was he as a communicator? And two, what were the big ideas that he wrote about? I know you discuss it in your book.
They do. I thought, in addition to talking about Lewis's communication, I have some preliminary chapters, and one is the making of a master communicator. And so Lewis was interested in language and stories. He was a reader as well as a writer, and some people say that's a key to being a good writer, is to being a good reader. And so he talks about this in his childhood. He had people who read him stories. But I think what finally made Lewis the communicator that he was and continues to be as people read his works is he had something to communicate about. Right. His conversion to Christianity ignited both his reason and his imagination. And his first two books, as both of you know, did not sell very well. But it was only after he discovered and came to faith about Christianity that ignited I believe, his reason and his imagination, and he became the communicator that he was.
We have a book talk scheduled for Jerry later this fall, where he talks about that book-length poem Dimer that Lewis wrote before he was a Christian. Yes. And Jerry really digs deeply into that poem and shows how that fit into Lewis's overall spiritual journey. So that'd be a nice tie-in. But I think we agree, once he became a Christian, he had something that was so all-consuming and wonderful that he wanted to share. I think it gave his communication skills an exponential growth in terms of his enthusiasm for the topic, his commitment to the topic. Sometimes with student papers, you can tell how interested they were in the topic by how good their writing is. And sometimes the writing's indifferent because their attitude is indifferent. And I think the same thing happened to Lewis. I think once he said, I'm going to use my communication gifts for the kingdom, there was no looking back for him, either spiritually or as a major voice in the 20th century.
He had written in one of his books that he felt the first problem in life is how do you bring head and heart together?
Yes.
How do you bring reason and romance together? And your first point in your book, when you talk about his style, is that there's a holistic approach that he takes. Tell us about that.
Yes, what I did for several years is I began to see that Lewis had something to say about communication. I know he taught me things about communication. So before I tried to put any kind of principle or system to it, I simply read Lewis, and anytime he said something about communication, I'd write it down and put it in a file. And it was after 2009, once I realized his focus on language and communication. And that's when I started to sort out these various ideas of Lewis. And I came up with 5 of them, 5 principles that formed the core of my book. And they focus on, they can each be summarized with a word. That Lewis was, the way he communicated, he was holistic, he was intentional, he was transpositional, he was evocative, and he focused on audience. He was audience-centered. So those are the ideas that the baskets. And I've continued to read Lewis, and I'm continuing to see, did I miss something? So as other people read Lewis and I have conversations about the book, I wonder if is there another basket somewhere? But I find most of what he said about communication falls into one of those 5 areas. And so that's the heart of the book that I've written.
Play out for us what you meant by intentional. Does that have to do with the fact that he had these things he wanted to say specifically, that he came with a mission?
Yes. And it was really in the manuscript that I identified, the one that no one thought existed. One of the things he did in that manuscript was he defined language for him. And one of the things he said specifically is that they are signs intended to mean. That if you're focusing on language, it's not just a happenstance. And that was consistent with Lewis's ideas about the Tao, about universal ideas and values and truth. He felt the same way about language. And so for him, communication faculty, we often ask our students fairly early in the course, we give them the epithet, you cannot not communicate. Do you believe in that? And is everything communication? C.S. Lewis would say, not everything is communication. It has to have intent. And so he writes about being intent. He says, if in those instances where you say, I know what I want to say, I just can't put it into words, C.S. Lewis would say, you don't know what you want to say. You need to think about it a bit more. That you need to be intentional before you communicate. And so he wrote about that and offered strategies of how to do that and modeled that himself.
Do you think that degree of focus led to his clarity as well as a writer?
I do. That's what people often say about Lewis, is that he was able to make abstract ideas, difficult ideas. If you think about what he was known for writing about, his spirituality and religion and the nature of God, people still read Lewis. The reason he still is a popular author is because he's able to make these abstract ideas clear and communicate, and because he thought about it. And it reflects not just his scribbling and his writing, but it reflects his thought. He was intentional. That was one of the things that I believe it makes Lewis Lewis. When I teach my course on C.S. Lewis, the first day of class, I give students the final exam. And there are 2 questions on the final exam that they get. It's attached to the last page of the syllabus. And the first question is, what did C.S. Lewis say about communication? And the second question is, what did C.S. Lewis do that made him an effective communicator? And so I believe these 5 principles organize what he said about communication. And he had a lot to say about being clear, about being intentional, about being brief. So perhaps I should stop there.
Well, one thing too, he wrote an essay called Transposition,
Yes.
and you have as one of your principles, transpositional. And I'm curious if you could help us understand what he meant by that and what you mean by that as you talk about this as one of the features of his communication style.
I'd be happy to. When I first developed the acronym HIT to stand for Holistic, Intentional, Transpositional, Evocative, Audience-Centered, originally the T was for translation, because Lewis said many times he just wanted to be a translator. He just wanted to clarify the gospel message in clear language. And so that was what I took him at his word until I started spending more time with Transposition, a sermon that he preached at Mansfield College. Today, that chapel is now a dining hall. So if you want to go to the place where Lewis gave that message, you have to go to the dining hall.
You and I have been there together.
We have. Transposition, to translate something, and Lewis was excellent at translating. Here's a word that means something else. Hola means hello. To transpose, Lewis said, is going from a higher, richer experience to a lower experience. And so we often talked about how do we make, and this is my story, this is what I share in terms of as I try to interpret Lewis. How do we make the ineffable effable?
Mm-hmm.
How do we communicate about something we cannot comprehend, the nature of goodness, the nature of God, the spirit, and the joys that await us? Lewis, through the process of transposition, I argue, was able to do that. And one of the 5 things he did better than most is he gave us glimpses of things that we can't quite understand yet. And he knew how to do that. So he was transpositional in that he helped communicate ideas that are almost beyond. He used several analogies. He said it's like if you had a symphony score and reduced it to a piano score, and the piano has to represent lots of other things. Mm-hmm. But if you've never heard a symphony and you didn't know that there was a symphonic score, and all you saw was the piano and heard the piano, it's trying to communicate that higher experience to the lower. All we have is a piano, or maybe just a flute, maybe just one note. Lewis was able to talk about, and what the reason I wrote this book is Lewis didn't just do these things. He talked about how to do those things.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so much of the book is not Steve Beebe. Much of the book is C.S. Lewis. I wanted Lewis's words to shine through. He's the master communicator. So I liberally cite him, as well as trying to interpret these ideas about Lewis as a communicator.
To what definition of symbolism?
Oh, I'm sorry, David.
I was saying, speaking of transposition, you had a quotation from Lewis, which I'd forgotten, which he said, symbolism is something given to the imagination which the intellect is not ready for.
Yes.
And I thought that was a fascinating definition of symbolism. And it fits just what you're saying about transposition, because in that essay, he himself offers all these wonderful examples of transposition. What I remember is that trying to take a 3-dimensional world and get it down on a white piece of paper.
Yes.
The color white of the paper may have to be a human face, it may have to be snow, it may have to be moonlight on the lake. It's a beautiful analogy of what he's talking about in terms you can really comprehend. Also, your musical analogy really works well.
Well, his problem, he said, is when we start believing that the smudges on the paper is what there is. And he says, no, there's an echo of a tune we have not yet heard. There's something more there. And if we just simply believe there's more than what meets the eye. And so he knew how to communicate about that. And he can teach us how to do that as well. So I think transposition, the concept of transposition, is one of his most unique, or if something could be most unique, one of his unique contributions to communication and communication principle.
His friend Austin Farah, the philosopher, the Oxford University philosopher, said Lewis was powerful in reason, but his great gift to us was his ability to depict things, his use of the imagination. Would that be important in the use of transpositional features?
It is, and it goes back to the H. We started with intentional and transposition, but the H of HIT, of the acronym for the principles, is holistic, of fusing reason and imagination. And Lewis was able to put those together, sometimes in the same sentence, sometimes in the same paragraph. Some of his works were more prosaic, were more intellectual, but even those were sprinkled with metaphors and similes. And that's one of the things that makes his reason sing and sparkle, because
Right.
he's able to appeal to our mind as he's making this rational, logical argument. So yes, he's holistic in that he puts those things together. And does it in the same paragraph, often in the same sentence.
And spell out for us evocative now.
Evocative, we've got holistic, intentional, transpositional. Lewis was a master at getting messages out of us. One principle that I teach my students about communication is this: it's better to get a message out of someone than to put one in them. We believe our own emotions, we believe our own data rather than someone else telling us something. Lewis knew how to get messages out of us. We participate in the story. We participate in Narnia. We are there, which is why we read it again and again and again. We know what will happen in Narnia, but yet we read it again because of what it does for us. It gets something out of us that those words are powerful in unlocking, uncorking, evoking. And in that chapter, I talk about the multiple ways he does that. He does it with word, he does it with story, he does it with myth. There are many ways, many strategies, but it's all about how can I get you to feel a certain way? And then
I love that letter he wrote to the little girl that you quote in your book, where he just say, don't say it was terrifying, evoke terror in the reader.
Yes.
Or don't say it was awesome, make the reader feel that awe. That was a very quick example of what you're talking about. Something needs to be happening in the reader emotionally, not just seeing the word on a page. That was a charming letter that he wrote that little girl. What was her name? Thomasine? Yes,
Thomasine. Don't tell us how to feel. Get it out of us.
Right.
And then so that's the notion of a story was, he said it was a net to catch something else.
Right.
Stories are about surprisingness. I go see La Boheme every time I can. I know Mimi's going to die at the end. I know what will happen, but I go listen to it, not because I'm wondering if in this production, maybe she'll live, maybe there'll be something that, no, but because of what it does for me, and Lewis knew how to do that with story, with myth, with his gift of poetry. He knew how to do that. And not only did he know how to do it, he told us how to do it. And that's what I try to talk about in the book is here's what he did, and here's how you can do that too.
I've been the recipient of your gifts of being able to do that, because you were able to draw to me a finished edition of my doctoral dissertation. And I'll always be grateful to you for guiding me through that last draft and giving me hope. What about audience-centered?
Well, that was the last principle that I talk about. And Lewis, many people, when they read Lewis, say it's like he's talking to me. Mm-hmm. Lewis knew his audience, and he talks about that in terms of why he's writing in a certain way. And it is, to me, of all the principles of communication, even apart from Lewis, that focusing on the audience is, I believe, the most important principle of human communication. When I teach public speaking, the very first day of class, I say, I'm going to give you the answer to every question I'm going to ask you about public speaking. So if we're in a discussion and you're not sure what I'm asking you, if you give this answer, it's probably the right answer. Would you like to know the answer to every question in this course? And they, I would. And I say the answer to every question about public speaking is, it depends upon the audience. How long should the speech be? You now know. Should I start with a joke? You know the answer to that question too. Lewis knew that as well, and Lewis didn't invent that, nor did I. It is, Aristotle wrote about it, but it's also the basis of every faith movement that ever existed. What we call the golden rule, the focus on others, is the basis for the way we treat and interact and communicate with every human being. Lewis knew that. Every faith movement builds that into how you relate, how you communicate to someone. And it's a powerful, powerful principle. So Lewis, again, not only did he do it, but he talked about how he did it and gave us some wonderful examples. One of the things that I enjoyed in the book is that I enjoyed doing some research is there are several times Lewis was not a very good communicator. And so in chapter 8, I detail some of his flops and mistakes. And often they were flops or mistakes because he didn't analyze the audience. But then I suggest that he learned. He was a quick study. And so he learned how to do that. And he was a master writer and speaker. And that gets back to the holistic. He wrote and spoke. Those were related processes for Lewis. But he was always focused on the audience, on which is why this evening we'll be asking people what questions do they have, because it depends upon the audience. It doesn't depend on the speaker.
What were the give us one or two flops, and then you end your book by talking to the reader as to how they could become a communicator like Lewis. Maybe you could fill us in on those two things.
Yes, there's several flops. One of his first presentations was advertised in the wrong place. It was, and so when he got there were only 4 people there. And he didn't do a very good job. And as it was supposed to be a series of lectures, it ended up to being only 2 people there. Finally, he said, no, let's go back to my room. And one of them was an elderly parson who liked to talk a lot. And so by the time the lecture series was over, Lewis became the audience as the parson would have this conversation. So that was a lecture series that was not a stellar C.S. Lewis presentation. And there are many more like that in chapter 8. The last chapter is how to communicate like C.S. Lewis. And Lewis was not just about being the theoretical. People love C.S. Lewis because it's practical, it's applied. So I thought I better do that too. So the last chapter of the book is how to communicate like C.S. Lewis. What can you do? What can we learn? What can I learn? Which I still learn a lot from the way Lewis communicated, both speaking, relating. So I have examples of ways to help in public, whether you're giving a speech or whether you're relating to a friend or an enemy. How can Lewis help us communicate better? And
your book is very readable. You can tell that you are a very effective communicator and scholar on communication. You do such a good job of summarizing your main points, of giving examples, of sometimes having some practical applications at the end of the chapter. I think it was really readable. I can really see your talents as a textbook writer coming out in this scholarly project.
I wanted my mom to be able to read it. My mother is 99 years old. I had a wonderful visit with her just this afternoon, and Mom actually read my book. And my mother's not known for her reading acuity, but she did read this. And I wanted it to be a book that even someone who's not interested in C.S. Lewis could find applicable. Yet most chapters have over 100 footnotes, so I wanted the Lewis scholars like the two of you to say, oh, okay, yeah, this makes sense. But I wanted it's there if you want all that kind of detail, but I wanted the message to be holistic and intentional, to go from richer to lower, to evoke, and always focused on the audience.
So your demographic for this book was 99-year-old readers. That was
yes, it was
intentional. Wow, I
figured that
that's an
covers,
unusual approach.
A lot of ground. If I stopped at 45 or so, that cuts my market in half.
That's right. That's right.
I think it might have been Jeff Davis, who's the Dean of Humanities here at Wheaton College, who told me that you were the most published college textbook author in communication textbooks. So here we've got a guy who has deep interest in Lewis, deep interest in communication. He turns his communicator eyes onto Lewis, and this was what was born. This was what was conceived in that union. And we're grateful to you for what you have given us in this book.
It's my pleasure. And again, I felt like I sort of stumbled into it. As I say, I was not a Lewis devotee. I knew about Lewis, but Lewis sort of grew with the rising sun with me. And now, as I put in my acknowledgments, my family have a couple of games. They take bets on what time of day will I first mention C.S. Lewis, and things like that. So because he continues to speak to me, and the purpose of this book is to help him speak to others in something that I believe is what we spend most of our life doing. You spend more time than anything you do in life communicating.
Mhm.
Lewis can help you do that about things that are worth communicating about.
Mm.
That's what this
Well,
book.
Never have a group of
said.
people, never have a group of people been more grateful for a man stumbling into something before than this.
Yes.
Yes, people are going to be going out to laundromats to see if they have an epiphany. They
Yeah.
wonder what's one waiting for them.
I'm going to go
Uh,
start camping out at laundromats.
Yeah. Speaking of audience, it's about 7:30, so let's be aware of our audience. And Crystal has appeared on the screen to help relay some questions we're getting from our viewers and listeners.
Yes, Steve, why don't you first reiterate the name of your book and the publisher? I understand the publisher is giving a 20% discount.
Sure.
Give us the title.
It's called C.S. Lewis and the Craft of Communication. It's published by Peter Lang. And yes, I do understand, and I think there's some information available for viewers. They're offering a 20% discount for a particular season on this particular book. And so that's if you order it directly from them. But if you miss that window, it's also available at Amazon and, as they say, other fine bookstores.
Okay, we have some great questions here. And someone sent a question early on, giving you kudos for this discovery at the Bodleian. And his name is Douglas Wensney, and he wants to know whether that manuscript you discovered is going to be published ever.
It has been published. It was published in an article that I wrote for Seven, the journal published by the Wade Center in 2010. I discovered it in 2009. And I remember submitting that manuscript after I thought I kind of figured out what this was. So I thought, well, where do I want to send it? I'll see if Seven, I don't know, that's a pretty big stretch. I don't know if they'd publish this or not. And I sent it in, and I got a wonderful, very kind email back saying, thank you, Professor Beebe. We're in sort of a backlog. It's going to take about 9 months before we'll be able to tell you anything about your manuscript. So I said, okay. And I didn't tell anyone about it. The next week, I had an email back that said, we think this is worth publishing. And I tell you, I've received lots of acceptance notices in my life, but that is the most thrilling acceptance notice that I've ever received. So it is published in the journal 7 in 2010, and it's published not in one complete whole document, but it makes up a core of what's included in my book as well. So the book provides an extended commentary on the ideas of that book.
And
Crystal and David, maybe you could tell those who are watching what Seven is and how they might acquire a subscription to it.
If you go to the Wade website and just Google the Wade Center and look under publications, it'll talk about Seven. It is our journal that has been produced for many, many years about the 7 authors who are archived at the Wade. And the Wade is the preeminent archive in the world for published and unpublished works by and about C.S. Lewis and 6 of his influences. Many of the articles are, we're getting all the articles digitized, and Steve's article is in volume 27. Now I have another question for you. Diana Ivy asks, do you think Lewis would enjoy being perceived as a communication professor?
I'd like to think he would. I think some of my best friends are communication professors, and he would welcome that. He might be a little stymied by it because he would understand rhetoric, and he sometimes, and he studied rhetoric, speeches, texts. Communication is broader than just rhetoric. And I suggest that Lewis was interested in relationships. And that's one of the things we teach our courses on interpersonal communication. Lewis was interested in group communication. He had some very insightful things. He wrote about things that now appear in our textbooks that when Lewis wrote about them in the 60s were not yet in our textbooks. He didn't give it the label groupthink, or he didn't use the term group dynamic synergy, but he described the concept beautifully. So I think with just a little bit of nudging, I would hope he would feel comfortable with that title. And I know I have learned, he has professed much about communication to me. So I would, if he didn't like it, I'll do my best to convince him that that's what he is.
He's already a professor.
He is.
Nate Hoover wonders how Lewis's interest in and the powerful influence of Sehnsucht on his sensibilities ties into his communication skills.
Well, he one of the big ideas that I talk about in chapter 2 is the notion of longing. That Lewis believed that there's something more that we want. And communication, because it's always about an audience and it's always driven by a goal, effective communication has a purpose. So I see that very compatible, the notion of longing, of desiring, of wanting something. I make a case in the book that there are various archetypes about stories, that they have certain, that the plots can be sorted out like rags to riches, voyage and return, overcoming the monster, various archetypes. What I argue, what I learned from C.S. Lewis, and it relates to the question, is that all stories, I suggest, are about one thing, not all these 7 or 8 or 10 or 20 archetypes. I suggest that all stories are about finding home. Voyage and return where? What do you do after you overcome the monster? We go home. Rags to riches, and what do we buy? What do we go? Where do we go? That our stories are about, and that comes from Lewis and the notion of longing. And so what we seek and what Lewis was telling us, that's a big idea. There's more here than we can comprehend. He'll do his best through transposition to communicate to us. So I think they're very closely related and very informative of his approach and philosophy to what his message was. I think that was one of his big ideas.
Definitely. We're always longing for a country we haven't yet visited.
We are, and we're
phrases.
In that case, and I also believe each of us are our own story, which means we're all searching for home. Now, that doesn't mean that some stories end before the protagonist finds home. We call those tragedies. So I'm not saying that every story ends happily and the person always finds home. What I am saying that conflict, which we've all agreed is a major issue in stories and narrative, it's conflict about what? It's about finding that, some cases literal, but sometimes metaphorical home. I believe that'll preach.
Gail Harlow asks whether you think the Narnia Chronicles would be considered transpositional. And she gives the example from the last battle when everyone winds up in Aslan's country. And she also thinks of Aslan telling Lucy that there are some things he can't do, and that is to make the dwarfs want to come out of their shell.
Without question, Gail, the answer is yes. That they are, the beauty of the Narnia Chronicles is they give us a glimpse of a home we've not yet visited, but we long for. And they put it in different terms. A supposal is what Lewis said, not a strict allegory in terms of, and even that I think was, he wanted it to be fuzzier. He didn't want us to spend time, now this is that and that is that. No, because it lets us evoke, it lets us bring ourselves to it. So yes, I think the Narnia Chronicles, actually I think the Narnia Chronicles brilliantly illustrate all 5 principles. There's reason and imagination. They're written but designed to be stories. They're holistic. He had a clear purpose for why he was writing them. Michael Ward has some very interesting ideas that I believe in terms of some implicit ideas that Lewis had about purpose that he didn't necessarily tell us about, but he wanted us to evoke. He wanted us to see that, and that's the power. By definition, Aslan is a transpositional figure. And that evokes from us. And of course, they're written for an audience for children of all ages. So yes, I think Narnia Chronicles can be explained. In fact, one of the reasons I wrote this book was, why is C.S. Lewis so effective? Why is he so popular? What is it about the way he communicated? Certainly his ideas are important, They are the ideas about our ultimate home and his Christian message. Of course, that's powerful. But I wrote this book to say Lewis had some ideas about how we can do that. And not only did he use them, he told us how to do that. And that's what my book tells you.
How old were you when you first read the Narnian book, Steve?
I think I was 46. I think I was 46. I remember going to
You
see.
had been on a desert island before then? What was the back?
I'd heard about them. I remember going to the movie Shadowlands. In fact, my family and I are in the crowd scene in Shadowlands. That was filmed in 1993, the year I was figuring out who C.S. Lewis was. And we're in one of the crowd scenes. But I remember watching that movie and the themes about Narnia and all of that. And I guess I need to read Narnia. I'm not quite sure what that is. So it was after the movie Shadowlands came out that my family and I are in, if you look for us. I told my students when I teach my class on C.S. Lewis, if you can find us in the movie, you get an automatic A for the course. So far, no one's received an automatic A for the course. But it was, I realized, oh, I think Narnia, what is that? So that came later after I started reading Lewis. So you're not looking at someone who's been reading Lewis all of his decades long, but brings a perspective that I've not let go of and I don't anticipate that I will.
Wow.
But I think part of the value of your work is so many of us have very immersed in Lewis studies, but we may not have another discipline or department or academic specialty to bring to our analysis. So I think there's something really fresh about the fact that you started out as a world-renowned communication scholar and then took those skills and that perspective to your study of Lewis. I think that's a very appropriate way to go about your career, actually.
I want to make sure to get in a question that comes all the way from Japan. Kyoko is teaching in a Japanese university, a course in Lewis and Tolkien. And she is saying that next week is her first day in the term to teach Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. And she said, if you were me, what would you say to my students in the first 1 minute? 99% of her students are not Christians. What would you say in that first 1 minute?
I would ask them, what are they longing for? Is there something missing in your life? Are you experiencing any pain or despair or sadness? Are you lonely? See if this book might help you understand that and give you some ideas about how to address that loneliness. Perhaps that's what I would say off the top of my head, but that's the first thing that comes to me.
It's excellent. Excellent.
It shows how shallow I am. I think I was going to say buy David Downing's book. He's got a Japanese translation on Narnia. So I'm really glad that you spoke first, Stephen.
Yeah.
Which book, David?
It's on all 7 books of the Chronicles.
Okay, we have a question from Ken Chase. How does Lewis practice transposition? What specific technique or techniques does he use that marks his transpositional practice as distinct from his holistic, intentional, and evocative communication practices?
I love that question. Lewis, if you open Mere Christianity, you can hardly find a page that doesn't include some metaphor, analogy, or comparison. The technique of transposition is metaphor, and I believe it's even more specific than that. I believe it's visual metaphor. Lewis often said some of his ideas began with images, with pictures. So I think what he does by using a visual metaphor, he's transposing what he sees into words. And the words that he's using are metaphors to help us find the ineffable, to help us hear the symphony that we don't even know what instruments have been invented yet, but he wants us to hear that. So he uses visual metaphor. I argue that Lewis was, there's some learning theories about Lewis, about you can be an audio learner, you learn best when you hear, you can be a kinesthetic learner, you must learn by doing, or a visual learner. I suggest, we don't have any tests, but I suggest perhaps Lewis was a visual learner because of his, what evidence of that? His photographic memory. He remembered what he read. He remembered what he saw. There's a letter from Tolkien who says Lewis could be in a conversation and years later could quote what people said. And he remembered what he saw as he saw conversations. So Lewis was a master at visual metaphor. In some respects, Narnia is a visual metaphor for something higher, and it's ineffable. His review of The Lord of the Rings, he said it's like lightning from a clear sky. That's transposition. And so he used short as well as novel length metaphor. And he told us how to do that. So I believe this is a powerful way to communicate about things that we just can't quite comprehend yet. We're only looking at the smudges on the paper. There really is something outside the cave. All we see are the flickering shadows. And Lewis said, look at that. And he told us and tried to tell us. And what's so powerful about C.S. Lewis is he had such good news to tell us. And so here's this master communicator that marshaled his talents of communication to help us look outside the cave, to let us hear that tune, to let us hear the symphony that we didn't even know that's the tune we wanted to hear.
Oh.
Or we didn't even know that's the news we want. We think there's some news we may want to read in the newspaper tomorrow. I'll let you discover what that is. But the news from a country we've not yet visited. But Lewis knew how to give us a hint of that. And he was a master speaker and writer. So thank you for that question. I think that's one of his most powerful strategies that is uniquely, now I say uniquely, others use metaphors, we all use metaphors, but Lewis artfully, he just wanted to be a poet. But my, what a master he was at crafting with word and with story and with myth ideas to communicate these.
That question that you enjoyed so much, Steve, you need to know was asked by the chairman of the communications department here at Wheaton College. So he wisely knew what to draw out of you.
He's a good communicator.
I have another question that's related to your wonderful answer. Andrew Lazo asks, how do you think high tea relates to Lewis's commitment to charity as well as to clarity? You've been talking about clarity through metaphor. What about charity? Well,
what I learned from my debating days, anytime you discuss a question, you need to define your terms. So what do we mean by charity? So if we define charity as love, as goodness, as giving, as modeling for us, if that's how we define it, and so for purposes of this discussion, that's how I'll define it. Yes, I think that was one of his big ideas. I suggest that his Christian message, which is the message of love, the message of charity, is one of his ideas. And in the book, I nominate 4 big ideas. I don't say these are the only ones, but I talk about longing, I talk about the Tao, I talk about the Christian message, and finally I talk about language. And I said one of his unique ideas on language. So I think that how do we communicate, how do we express, and even how do we receive as we are pilgrims and we try to receive messages? How do we receive? Holistically, really realizing there is an intent for us to receive that. Knowing the source, if transposition is higher to lower, knowing that, where does this come? It comes from above. Knowing that, how do I know that it's true? I feel it. It comes from that gentle spirit that reminds me that it's true. And that message understands me. It's like this person knew me. So I think it's not just a clinical literary technique that's only applied to a text for purposes of academic enjoyment or enlightenment. I think Lewis knew something about how to connect these ideas of love and the bigger ideas of why we were made.
Mm. One anonymous attendee mentions that you have discovered in your research 2 unpublished poems written by Lewis. And they want to know if you can give us an example of the content of the poems and whether they align with the high T principles you are discussing in your book.
In my process of looking at Lewis manuscripts, and that's my favorite thing to do when I go to Oxford, even now, even after I've written the book, and I love to go to the reading room and check out manuscripts. And now what I like to do is look behind the pages. And so it was 3 or 4 years ago, I found on the back of a page of the manuscript, The Language of Religion, when Lewis was writing about, on the other side, he was writing about poetic language. He apparently decided to write a poem. So on the back of that piece of paper, on the back of the manuscript, kind of sideways, was a poem. And it's about language. In fact, it's included. If you want to read the poem, it's on page 92. I published it because it's about language. It's about the fun. It's really, usually when I do read it, it usually gets some chuckles, and it's a clever use of language and dis and un, and it's very clever. I call it a poem doodle. I'm not sure how. In the great archives of Lewis poetry, I talked to Don King, my friend Don, in terms of being a life-changing poem. But the second one I found just a couple of years ago, I was looking at one of Lewis's notebooks, and in pencil, when you open it up, in pencil on one side were a few scribbles, and then on the other side were a few other scribbles. And I said, well, what is this? What is he saying here? And then what I realized when I transcribed them, it was a 14-line sonnet. And again, the first person I asked was Don King. Don, do you know about this? And then with some help from my friend Charlie Starr, who's expert at looking at Lewis handwriting, we deduced that it was a sonnet. It's about seeing with eyes anew. This was probably written in 1939, between 1935 and 1939, so after Lewis's conversion. But it has to do with being able to make the invisible visible, to see with new eyes. And that's a theme in Lewis's writing as well. So whoever asked me that, thank you very much. Those have just been extra joys to stumble across little tidbits of things sprinkled within Lewis that continued to, he was so prolific and so inspiring. So those poems, and one is published, one is not published. In fact, I thought about drafting an article for 7 about some of the things. I've got another manuscript or 2 of little pieces that Lewis wrote that I haven't seen in print, some little tidbits here and there that I might put together as an article about Lewis's scraps.
That would be great.
What ended up on the...
Everybody needs to go online and see 7 for these wonderful little bits.
I was just reading a book by Ed Brown, the book collector, about all these things he found on the backs of letters. And one of them, there's just one sentence that said, the children trained the bears in a loop of the river. That's the entire sentence. That's the beginning of a Narnia Chronicle. What was that? You know, so I would love to see a collection of scraps like that. Talk about evocative.
Well, I continue to, Ed, God rest his soul, was a good friend of mine, and he was very helpful as I was beginning my Lewis collecting bad habits. But yes, so every time I go to Oxford, I go and sometimes I'm looking, I have an idea, but other times the 2 poems I found serendipitously. I wasn't looking to find an unpublished poem, but it just adds to my joy of that, you know, as I think about 25 years ago in my career, C.S. Lewis would not at all have been in my vocabulary, and what Lewis has done to make life fun and exciting.
Mm-hmm. Carrie Magruder asks about experiment and criticism, pointing out that Lewis suggested that a measure of good reading is the intention to read a book more than once.
Yes.
Which book of Lewis's do you expect to read most often?
The books that I continue to go back to, I love the Narnia stories. I know what will happen in the end. I know the plot, but that's not why I read them. The masterful Mere Christianity, I read just for his beauty and cleverness and clearness in communication. So every time I read it, I find a different application of him being holistic, intentional, transpositional, evocative, and audience-centered.
Oh.
I find, oh my gosh, there it is. And so those are a couple. I love The Great Divorce. It's one of my favorite books. I love his reason and imagination. What a wonderful, inventive book. But he has a point in mind. He's intentional. So those are some of my favorite. The ones I at the moment. And the thing about Lewis, Jerry has counted with his friend Mark Neal 17 different genres of Lewis, depending upon your interest, whether you want poetry or science fiction. But those are the ones I go to the most often for what they do to me. I get them because of how they change me, and so that would be.
So the
today.
next question has to do with genre. Ted Lewis mentions the shift in Lewis from apologetics in the 40s to other kinds of writings, other genres in the 50s, and perhaps choosing not to return to the realm of public debate. And of course, communication theory has to do with public debate. Can you reflect on how this transition informs Lewis's sense of what it means to be a clear and charitable communicator?
I would look at it from the standpoint of the 5 principles that now, Lewis, by the way, didn't name these 5 principles what I'm naming them. So Lewis might be surprised that I've called them holistic intent, but in answering that question, I would look at the way Lewis communicated. And he had a span, as the questioner notes, from more apologetic, persuasive, prosaic works to more narrative fictional works. But that's within his approach of being holistic at different times of his life. Throughout all of them, each book had a point. Lewis does not wander. Lewis knows what he wants to say. They're all intentional, whether he was arguing in a debate or writing a poem. There was a point he had in mind. For Lewis, once his life was changed, once his life was changed, it was about communicating the joy that he discovered. And so there was that transposition. Lewis is popular. He said he wasn't very good at the altar call emotion, kind of the high emotion of other speakers and preachers. That wasn't C.S. Lewis. He was, so in the entire span, I don't think he knew how to get these messages out. And all of those books, regardless of whether they were more prosaic, apologetical to more fiction, he knew his audience. And that's one reason he continues to sell. In fact, the experiment in criticism is really about let the reader decide. Judge a book by what the reader says. So the answer to which books are effective or powerful, let's see what the readers think. So I think high T can apply to analyzing Lewis's sweep of productivity, his amazing productivity over his amazing career.
Michael Burns then asks, while you were writing your book, were there any of Lewis's writings that you suddenly saw or thought about differently in light of high T? Michael is curious how your perceptions changed while you were making sense of his powers of communication.
I think I had greater appreciation for an experiment in criticism. I had greater appreciation for Studies in Words. Studies in Words is kind of a quirky little book in terms of it's not one of his most popular as he looks, but yet embedded within there, I found some wonderful insights that I might have missed had I not been on my quest to look and see what Lewis said about communication. There's some wonderful little nuggets there. So yes, there are things that I wouldn't have seen. And obviously even the manuscript that I identified, I didn't know what it was. And it took a laundry epiphany and Diana Glyer to help me see what I hadn't seen before. So my journey with Lewis, yes, I can, and I continue to see things in reading as I go back and reread Lewis. And I'm so thankful for the Austin group that was patient with me as they would read a book a month. And so in the course of 5 or 6 years, we read Lewis. And as I would bring these up and kind of make these applications, and as I still read Lewis, I still see new insights based on things from the particular lens that I now bring to Lewis studies. Thank you.
I have two questions from two listeners that could be combined. Rick McNabb is interested in what you think were Lewis's greatest, what authors influenced Lewis's communication most greatly. But then another listener, Sylvia Ware, was talking about a possible influence insofar as she heard that Lewis's father was deaf, and may this have affected his perception of communication.
I must say I'm not really familiar with Lewis's father's hearing acuity. I don't really know about that. I know that they had an interesting, sometimes challenging relationship with Lewis and his father. But that too, I think, helped Lewis, just as I talked about how Lewis's communication failures with an audience, Lewis's communication challenges interpersonally in relationships. Not all of his students thought he was a fantastic teacher. Some didn't think he was a very good teacher at all. Some loved him. Some thought he was a little aloof. Some thought he was too harsh. I once met a couple who'd studied with Lewis, and they thought, oh, he was a bully. But then they said, he wouldn't beat up on people that he didn't think would take it. I'm varying from the question a little bit, so I'm not sure about Lewis's. So the larger question is, what influenced Lewis? In the book, I identify what Lewis said, the books that Lewis identified, The Everlasting Man, I know Phantastes, and some other books that he lists that were influenced. At different times, he came up with slightly different lists. So depending upon when you ask him, depending upon how he was influenced by his recollection of what he read, but you can be sure he remembered what he read because he knew all of them and had those quotes. So I end one of the chapters with the subdivision, A Mind Awake, which is the title of is that Clyde Kilby's book?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I just think that is what Lewis is about. And so these books that he read, the experiences that he had, including the challenges with his father, his relationship with Joy, his challenges with his stepsons, Mrs. Moore is another element that I think helped his communication, because he had her in mind as an audience, just as I thought about my mom. Lewis thought about, I believe, Mrs. Moore as someone who is not exactly warm and fuzzy about these ideas.
Mm-hmm.
But Lewis didn't want to limit his audience. So
Some people think the mother in Screwtape Letters, he got some material from Mrs. Moore. Remember, it says she was a woman who lived for others. You could spot the others by the hunted look on their face.
Yes.
He benefited some of his domestic relationships.
There is a follow-up question from Andrew Lazo as to what you think of Till We Have Faces. Is it a success or a failure of high tea?
Well, I think it's a success of high tea. I think for some people it's an enigmatic work, and I think we are thankful to brilliant scholars who can help us unlock some of those ideas. Lewis, it was a novel, yet he makes there's wonderful arguments in the book about, so it's holistic. Lewis had an intent in why he was writing that book. He thought it was his best book. In the story, I mean, he'd struggled with writing about this particular myth and bringing it to us. And how do I transpose this Greek myth into a story that we can understand today? And in reading it, its challenge is, what does it evoke from you? And some wonder, what audience is it designed for? But yes, I do believe you can use as a structure, as a way of talking about this book. And what I suggest in my book is all Lewis books are holistic, intentional, transpositional, evocative, and focus on what we've had the pleasure of these questions tonight, the audience.
That's a great way to end. Thank you so much, Steven,
Yes.
for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Beebe, and thank you, Dr. Root, and thank you, Dr. Downing, for joining us for this really lively discussion. I thought it was really edifying and
Thank you to all
stimulating.
our listeners. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. There were just so many wonderfully intelligent questions. So
You know,
what you're going to have to do is buy Dr. Beebe's book.
we're a paradox squared.
There you go.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Goodbye,
night.
all.
Thank you
Good
again,
night.
Steve. That was really interesting.
Thank you. Thank you.